Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, or if someone you trusted turned out to be someone you didn't recognize anymore, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. I met my husband, Daniel, when I was 27 years old enough to believe I knew what love looked like, but still young enough to trust promises without asking for proof. He wasn't flashy or loud. He was calm, deliberate, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. When he talked about his dreams, his eyes softened, not with hunger for money, but with a desire to build something steady. That's what he told me his business was about: stability, legacy, something we could grow together. We married after 3 years of dating. Nothing extravagant. A small ceremony, my mother crying quietly in the front row, his hand squeezing mine when I stumbled over my vows. For the first few years, our life was simple. We rented a modest apartment. I worked as a receptionist at a medical clinic. Daniel ran his logistics company, mostly from a small office with 2 employees and a lot of ambition. Some months were better than others, but we managed. We laughed a lot back then. We cooked dinner together, watched late-night movies, argued about silly things like whose turn it was to buy groceries. When I got pregnant with our son, Daniel cried. I remember him kneeling in front of me, pressing his forehead against my stomach, whispering promises to a life not yet born. That memory stayed with me for years. I held on to it, even when things started to change. The business trouble didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, like water seeping through cracks you don't notice until the floor starts to rot. Daniel began coming home later. His phone never left his hand. He took calls in the bathroom, on the balcony, sometimes even in the car after parking, sitting there long enough that I'd look out the window and wonder why he hadn't come inside yet. When I asked him, gently at first, he told me contracts were falling through, clients weren't paying on time, fuel prices were rising. He spoke in numbers and terms I didn't fully understand, and I trusted him because he was my wife. Because trust is supposed to be the foundation, not something you demand receipts for. Then one evening, after our son had gone to bed, Daniel sat across from me at the kitchen table. His shoulders were slumped. His eyes were tired in a way I hadn't seen before. He said the words quietly, like they might break if he said them too loud. The business had failed, completely. He said he tried everything: loans, partnerships, cutting costs. Nothing worked. The company was shutting down. I remember feeling my chest tighten, not with anger, but with fear. Our savings weren't much. My income alone couldn't carry us for long. I asked him what we would do. He took my hands and said we'd get through it together. That phrase again, together. The months that followed were heavy. Daniel sank into himself. He stayed home more, but not in a comforting way. He was distant, distracted, often irritable. I picked up extra shifts at the clinic. I sold a gold bracelet my grandmother had given me. We canceled plans. No more small luxuries, no dinners out, no weekend trips. I learned to stretch meals, to pretend I wasn't tired, to reassure him when he looked defeated. What I didn't know was that while I was tightening our lives, he was expanding another one somewhere else. There were signs, of course, there always are, but when you love someone, you explain them away. Daniel still dressed well when he left the house, even though he claimed he had nowhere to go. He started showering twice a day. He was oddly protective of his phone, changing passwords, turning the screen away from me. When I asked if he was looking for work, he said yes, but interviews kept falling through. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. One afternoon, about 8 months after the business supposedly collapsed, Daniel said he had to meet an old contact who might help him get back on his feet. He asked to borrow the car because his was acting up. I agreed, even though something in my chest felt unsettled. After he left, I left my wallet in the car. Inside was my clinic ID, and I needed it for my evening shift. I called him. No answer. I texted. Nothing. I waited, pacing the living room, checking the time. Finally, I grabbed my keys and took a taxi, hoping I could catch him wherever he was before he went too far. I tracked the location through an app we both shared for emergencies, something we had set up years ago and never turned off. The address led me to a part of town I'd never been to. Quiet streets, well-kept lawns, not the kind of place you'd go for a casual business meeting. My heart began to pound as the taxi slowed. I told the driver to stop a little ways down the street. I walked the rest of the way, my hands shaking. Daniel's car was parked in front of a neat, pale yellow house, curtains drawn, children's toys scattered on the lawn. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. Maybe he was meeting someone who lived there. Maybe I was overreacting. That's what I told myself as I stepped closer. Then the front door opened. Daniel stepped out, holding a little girl by the hand. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She was laughing, saying something I couldn't hear. Behind them stood a woman. She rested her hand on Daniel's shoulder in a way that was familiar, intimate, the way I used to. I don't remember moving, but suddenly I was closer, close enough to hear the woman say something about dinner being ready, close enough to see Daniel lean down and kiss the little girl on the head, close enough to hear him call her sweetheart. The world didn't shatter all at once. It went quiet first, like someone had turned down the volume on my life. My legs felt weak, my vision blurred. I must have made a sound because Daniel looked up. Our eyes met. I will never forget that look. Shock, yes, fear, but also something else. Calculation. He froze, the little girl still holding his hand. The woman followed his gaze and saw me standing there, my face pale, my mouth slightly open. She looked confused, then wary. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. Instead, I stood there, holding the weight of a truth I was not ready to carry. Daniel let go of the child's hand and walked towards me slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. He asked what I was doing there, not why I was there, not how he found me, what I was doing there, as if I was the one who had wandered into the wrong life. I asked him who they were. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, thin and distant. He didn't answer right away. The woman stepped forward and asked him who I was. That was the moment I understood. I was the secret. Not her, not the child. Me. Daniel told her I was his sister. I watched the lie leave his mouth so easily it made me sick. I didn't correct him. I couldn't. The words were stuck somewhere deep inside me, tangled with shock and disbelief. The woman nodded slowly, relief washing over her face. She apologized for the confusion, said she hadn't known he had family nearby. I don't remember what excuse I gave before I turned and walked away. I only remember the sound of my footsteps on the pavement, the way my chest burned as I tried to breathe, the way my phone vibrated with messages from Daniel that I didn't read. That night, I sat in our small apartment, the place I had stretched and sacrificed for, and stared at the walls like they were strangers. Daniel came home late. He tried to explain. He said it wasn't what it looked like. He said the business hadn't really failed, not completely. He said he had investments, opportunities. He said the woman was someone who helped him financially when things got bad. He didn't say she was his partner. He didn't say the child was his daughter. But I already knew. I lay awake until morning, listening to him breathe beside me, realizing that the man I had trusted with my life had built another one while I was busy holding ours together. And in that quiet dawn, something inside me began to change. The morning after I saw Daniel with that child, the apartment felt smaller than it ever had before. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower, as if the truth had sucked all the air out of the space. Daniel left early, claiming he needed to clear his head. I didn't stop him. I didn't ask where he was going. I already knew. I stayed seated at the kitchen table long after he left, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. Our son was still asleep in his room, his small breaths steady and innocent. I watched the light creep in through the window and tried to piece together how long my life had been a lie without me noticing. When our son woke up, I went through the motions: breakfast, packing his bag, walking him to school. Other parents smiled at me, complained about traffic, talked about homework. I nodded and responded when necessary, but I felt like I was watching myself from far away, like this couldn't possibly be my life they were all interacting with. Once I was alone again, I sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed myself to cry. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the quiet, broken sobs that come when you're afraid someone might hear you falling apart. I cried for the years I had given, for the jewelry I had sold, for the nights I had stayed awake worrying about money while he was tucking another child into bed. By the afternoon, the crying stopped. Not because the pain was gone, but because something else took its place. Clarity. A sharp, steady awareness that I needed the truth, not the softened version Daniel kept offering. When he came home that evening, I didn't yell, I didn't accuse. I asked him to sit down. He looked relieved, like he expected a storm and found only calm. That relief made my stomach turn. I asked him one question: how long? He hesitated, then said a few months. The lie was clumsy. I stared at him until his eyes dropped to the floor. He admitted it had been years, nearly as long as we had been married. The business hadn't failed the way he said it had. It had struggled at times, yes, but it was still running. The money was divided. 2 households, 2 lives, 2 versions of him. The woman's name was Rachel. He met her through a client. She knew he was married, at least at first. He said things became complicated. He said he felt trapped. He said he didn't want to hurt anyone. Every word felt like an insult. I asked him if the child was his. He nodded. I asked if there were others. He shook his head quickly, swearing it was just one. Just one, as if that made it easier to swallow. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I told him to leave. He looked genuinely surprised. He said we needed to talk more. He said we had a son. He said we could fix this. That word again. Together. I told him there was no together left. He packed a bag slowly, like someone waiting to be stopped. I didn't stop him. That night, after I tucked our son into bed, he asked where his father was. I told him Daniel was staying somewhere else for a while. He accepted that answer easily, because children trust the people they love. I wondered how long it would take before he learned not to. The days that followed were heavy but strangely focused. I didn't collapse. I didn't beg. I started making lists, practical things, bank accounts, bills, documents. I realized quickly how little I actually knew about our finances. Daniel had always handled that. Another mistake I never thought I'd regret this much. I requested bank statements. I reviewed old emails. I checked records from the business registry. What I found made my hands shake. The company was not only still active, it was profitable. There were accounts I had never seen, transactions I had never been told about. Money had been moved, split, redirected. He hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, he had planned it financially. I contacted a lawyer quietly. I didn't tell my family. I wasn't ready for their questions or their pity. The lawyer listened without interrupting, her face calm and professional. She told me I wasn't the first woman to sit in that chair with a story like mine, and I wouldn't be the last. She explained my rights. She explained what documentation we would need. She explained that I had been more than patient. I had been deceived. Daniel called every day at first. He apologized, he blamed stress, he blamed fear, he blamed love in a way that made it sound like an accident. I kept my responses short, about our son only, pickups, drop-offs, school matters, nothing else. One afternoon, a week after he moved out, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Rachel stood there. She looked smaller up close, tired. Her eyes flicked behind me as if expecting to see Daniel. She said she needed to talk. She said she didn't know he was still living with me. She said he told her we were separated. I believed that she believed him. That didn't make it hurt less. She told me about their life, the vacations, the plans, the way he talked about building a future with her. She showed me pictures on her phone, birthdays I wasn't invited to, smiles I had never seen. It felt like I was watching proof of my own replacement. When she left, I sat on the floor and stared at the door for a long time. I realized then that Daniel hadn't just lied to me, he had lied to everyone. And he'd done it so smoothly that both of us thought we were the only ones standing beside him. That was the day I stopped feeling confused and started feeling resolved. I didn't want revenge in the dramatic sense. I didn't want to ruin his life. I wanted my life back, and I was willing to fight for it. In the weeks that followed, I learned how quickly a life can reorganize itself around pain. The shock faded into a dull, constant ache, one that lived in my chest and followed me through my days. I went to work, smiled at patients, answered phones, and came home to a quiet apartment that no longer felt like a shared space. It felt like mine, and that realization was both comforting and terrifying. Daniel stopped calling every day. His messages became less apologetic and more practical. He wanted to talk about schedules, about money, about what we were going to tell people. I noticed how carefully he avoided certain topics, how he still tried to control the narrative. That was when I understood something important. He wasn't ashamed of what he did. He was afraid of what it would cost him. My lawyer advised me to keep records of everything, every message, every transaction, every inconsistency. So I did. I became meticulous. I created folders, both digital and physical. I learned more about Daniel's business in a month than I had in our entire marriage. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that his story of failure was a performance, a convenient one. It justified my sacrifices and masked his duplicity. One evening, while sorting through old files, I found a document that made my breath catch. It was a property lease agreement. The address was the same house I had seen that afternoon. The name on the lease was not Daniel's. It was the business's. He hadn't just been supporting a second family. He had been using company resources to do it. Resources that legally belonged to both of us. The next day, I handed the document to my lawyer. She nodded slowly, the way people do when they know they've just been given leverage. She explained what it meant, how it strengthened my position. For the first time since everything began to unravel, I felt something close to power. Daniel noticed the shift in me almost immediately. When we met to discuss our son's schedule, he watched me closely, as if trying to read my thoughts. He asked if I was okay. I said I was managing. He said he wanted us to stay civil. I told him that depended on his honesty. That word again, honesty. It hung between us like a challenge. A few days later, he asked if we could talk privately. No lawyers, no accusations, just us. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a cafe near our old apartment, neutral ground. He arrived late, looking tired but composed. The man I had once trusted implicitly sat across from me like a stranger wearing a familiar face. He tried one last time to rewrite the past. He said he never meant to hurt me. He said he felt pressure to be everything to everyone. He said he loved our son and would always provide for him. When I didn't respond, he grew frustrated. He asked what I wanted. I told him the truth. I wanted fairness. I wanted transparency. I wanted what I had been denied for years. And I wanted him to stop pretending he was the victim of circumstances when he had been the architect of them. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something shift. The calm cracked. He accused me of being cold, of trying to punish him. He said Rachel depended on him. He said the child was innocent in all this. I agreed. The child was innocent. That was why I refused to let him manipulate the situation any further. When I left the cafe, my hands were shaking, but my steps were steady. I realized I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I was disappointed, and disappointment, I learned, is a powerful form of freedom. The legal process was slow and exhausting. There were meetings, documents, negotiations. Daniel tried to minimize, to delay, to bargain, but the evidence spoke louder than his words. The court didn't care about his excuses or his feelings. It cared about facts, and the facts were on my side. Throughout it all, I focused on our son. I made sure his world stayed as stable as possible. I answered his questions honestly but gently. His father loved him. His parents were living separately. Some things change, but love doesn't disappear overnight. I didn't know if that was entirely true, but I wanted it to be. Rachel never contacted me again. I heard through Daniel that she was angry, that she felt betrayed too. I felt a strange empathy for her. We were both collateral damage in his carefully managed life, different roles, same outcome. Months later, the settlement was finalized. I received my share of the business assets, enough to breathe again, enough to rebuild without fear. Daniel moved fully into his other life, no longer divided, no longer hiding. I wondered sometimes if he felt relieved. On the day everything became official, I stood alone in the apartment and looked around. It no longer felt like a place of loss. It felt like a beginning, quiet, uncertain, but mine. That night, after my son fell asleep, I sat by the window and reflected on the years I had spent believing in a story that wasn't real. I thought about trust, about how easily it can be given and how painfully it can be taken away. I realized that loving someone doesn't mean abandoning yourself. I didn't get revenge, not the kind people imagine. I got something better. I got clarity. I got justice. And I got the chance to live a life that wasn't built on lies. If there is a lesson in all of this, it's this. Pay attention to the quiet moments, the unexplained absences, the stories that don't quite add up. And if you ever find yourself shrinking so someone else can live larger, know that you deserve more. I learned it the hard way, but I learned it in time. The weeks after the settlement were strangely calm, not happy, not sad, just quiet in a way my life hadn't been for years. There were no late-night arguments, no sudden phone calls, no waiting for someone to come home and explain themselves. Silence, I learned, can be unsettling when you're used to noise, but it can also be healing. I moved us into a smaller place, closer to my son's school. It wasn't fancy, but it was bright, and the windows let in a lot of morning light. The first night we slept there, my son asked if this was our new home. I told him yes. He smiled and said it smelled new. That simple comment made my throat tighten. I realized how much he needed a sense of certainty and how determined I was to give it to him. Daniel came by twice a week to see our son. At first, the visits were stiff. He would linger in the doorway, unsure of where to sit, what to say to me. I kept things polite and brief. Over time, we found a rhythm, not friendship, not forgiveness, but cooperation. I learned that boundaries weren't walls meant to punish someone else. They were lines meant to protect me. One afternoon, months later, Daniel asked if we could talk after he dropped our son off. I hesitated, then agreed. We sat at the small kitchen table, the same one where I used to drink cold coffee and wonder how everything had gone so wrong. He looked older somehow, more worn. The confidence he once carried so easily was gone. He told me he was struggling, not financially, emotionally. He said living one life had felt easier than juggling two, but it hadn't brought him peace. He said Rachel didn't trust him anymore. He said the child asked questions he didn't know how to answer. He asked if he ever thought we could have fixed things if he told the truth earlier. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him the truth. Maybe we could have faced hard times together. Maybe we could have rebuilt. But lies change people. They harden trust in ways love alone can't soften. I told him I didn't hate him. I just didn't recognize him anymore. He nodded slowly, like someone finally accepting a verdict they'd been avoiding. When he left, I felt lighter, not because his pain comforted me, but because I no longer felt responsible for carrying it. As the months passed, I began to rediscover parts of myself I had put away. I enrolled in evening classes I had once postponed because money was tight and time was never enough. I started running again, early in the mornings while the world was still quiet. I made new friends, people who knew me not as someone's wife, but as myself. There were moments when the grief resurfaced unexpectedly, a song on the radio, a memory triggered by a familiar street. Healing, I learned, isn't linear. It doesn't erase the past. It teaches you how to live with it without letting it define you. One evening, as I tucked my son into bed, he asked if I was happy. The question caught me off guard. I thought about it carefully before answering. I told him I was learning how to be. He smiled, satisfied with that answer, and rolled over to sleep. After he closed his eyes, I sat beside him for a while, watching his chest rise and fall. I thought about the woman I had been at 27, trusting, hopeful, unaware. I didn't blame her. She loved honestly. That wasn't her flaw. It was her strength. I promised myself I would never punish that part of me for someone else's deception. If you're listening to this and you're in the middle of something similar, I want you to know this. The truth will hurt, but it will also set you free. You are not weak for trusting. You are strong for surviving what came after. My husband said his business failed, and I believed him. I lost more than money. I lost years, certainty, and the version of my life I thought I was living. But I gained something I didn't even know I was missing, my own voice. And this time, I listened to it. Life didn't transform overnight into something bright and effortless. Healing had a way of sneaking up on me in small, unremarkable moments. The first time I laughed without forcing it. The first morning I woke up without that familiar heaviness pressing on my chest. The first time I realized an entire afternoon had passed without me thinking about Daniel at all. Those moments surprised me. They felt almost disloyal at first, as if moving forward meant denying what I'd been through. But slowly I understood that remembering didn't require reliving the pain over and over. It required acknowledging it and choosing not to let it decide the rest of my life. Work became more than just a paycheck. I applied for a better position at the clinic, something I would have talked myself out of before, telling myself it wasn't the right time. This time, I didn't hesitate. When I got the promotion, I celebrated quietly with my son. We ordered takeout and ate on the living room floor, laughing when the sauce spilled. It wasn't a grand victory, but it felt honest. Daniel remained a presence, but no longer the center of my emotional world. Our conversations were limited to parenting. Sometimes I could hear the strain in his voice. Other times he sounded almost cheerful, like he was trying to convince himself everything was fine. I stopped trying to read between the lines. That wasn't my responsibility anymore. One afternoon, I ran into an old friend at the grocery store. She asked how I'd been, and for the first time, I didn't give the automatic polite answer. I told her the truth, briefly, without details. She squeezed my hand and said she was proud of me. That simple acknowledgement made my eyes sting. I realized how rarely we tell each other that surviving something hard is an achievement. At home, I began to make the space truly ours. I rearranged furniture, donated things that carried too much memory,
hung pictures that made me smile. The apartment slowly stopped feeling like a temporary shelter and started feeling like a home, a place of rest, not recovery. There were nights when doubt crept in. I would lie awake and wonder if I could have done something differently, if I had asked more questions, if I had paid closer attention. But then I reminded myself that responsibility belongs to the person who chooses to deceive, not the one who chooses to trust. That reminder became a quiet mantra. One evening, Daniel called unexpectedly. He sounded unsettled. He told me Rachel had moved out, that she couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore, that trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild easily, even when the truth is finally out. I listened, calm and distant. When he finished, he asked if I thought this was karma. I told him I didn't believe life worked that way. I believed actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences show up quietly, without drama or spectacle. He was silent for a long moment before thanking me for listening. After we hung up, I sat there thinking about how different this conversation would have felt a year ago, how desperate I would have been to fix his pain. Now I simply acknowledged it and let it go. My son adjusted in ways that amazed me. Children have a resilience that adults often forget. He thrived with routine, with honesty, with consistency. He loved his father, and I never stood in the way of that. But he also grew more attached to our new life, to the calm of our evenings, to the predictability of our days. I watched him become more confident, more open, and I knew that choosing peace had been the right decision. One Sunday afternoon, while we were baking together, he looked up at me and said, "You don't cry as much anymore." The observation was simple, innocent. I smiled and told him that sometimes people cry when they're figuring things out, and sometimes they stop when they have. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to stirring the batter. That night, after he went to bed, I reflected on how far I had come. The woman who once stood on a quiet street watching her husband open the door to another life felt like someone I knew, but not someone I was anymore. That moment had broken me open, but it had also forced me to see myself clearly. I understood now that love without honesty is not love. It's control disguised as protection. I understood that loyalty shouldn't require self-erasure. And I understood that starting over isn't a sign of failure, it's an act of courage. I didn't emerge from this story unscarred. There are marks left behind, invisible but real. They remind me to ask questions, to trust my instincts, to speak up when something feels wrong. They remind me that my voice matters. If you're listening and you're in a marriage, a relationship, or a family dynamic where you feel small, unseen, or constantly confused, please hear this. Confusion is often the first sign that truth is being withheld. Pay attention to it. You deserve clarity. You deserve respect. You deserve a life that doesn't require you to shrink so someone else can expand. My husband said his business failed, and for a long time I believed him. What truly failed was his ability to live honestly. What survived was me. And that is something no one can take away.
As time went on, the sharp edges of the betrayal softened into something more manageable. Not forgotten, never erased, but placed gently into the past where it belonged. I stopped measuring my days by what had been lost and started noticing what was being built instead. There was a quiet confidence growing in me, one I hadn't felt before. It showed up in small decisions, saying no without explaining myself, speaking up at work when I had an idea, choosing rest over guilt. I realized how much of my old life had been shaped around accommodating Daniel's moods, his stress, his ambitions. Without that constant adjustment, I finally had room to breathe. One evening, I attended a small gathering hosted by a colleague. Nothing fancy, just a few people sharing food and conversation. I almost didn't go. Old habits told me to stay home, to avoid new spaces, new faces. but I went anyway. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't introduced as someone's wife or someone's other half. I was simply me. It felt unfamiliar, but freeing. A man there struck up a conversation with me. He was kind, attentive, and asked thoughtful questions. When he complimented me, it wasn't about how patient I was or how supportive. It was about my insight, my humor. I didn't feel a rush or a spark the way movies describe. I felt respected, and that meant more to me than anything else. I didn't pursue anything further, not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't ready. I was learning to enjoy my own company, to trust my judgment again. I wanted my next chapter, whatever it looked like, to be chosen from wholeness, not loneliness. Daniel's presence in my life continued to fade into the background. We coordinated schedules smoothly now. Conversations were brief, almost businesslike. He no longer tried to draw me into his emotional struggles. Perhaps he sensed that door was closed. Perhaps he finally understood that some things, once broken, don't return to their original shape. There was one moment, though, that stayed with me. It happened during a school event for our son. Parents sat together, clapping, smiling, watching their children perform. Daniel sat a few rows away. At one point, our eyes met. He smiled, a soft, uncertain expression, like someone remembering something they no longer had access to. I nodded politely and looked back at the stage. In that moment, I felt no anger, no longing, just acceptance. The story we shared had ended, and that was okay. Later that night, after putting my son to bed, I sat alone with my thoughts. I realized how much strength it had taken to reach this place, strength I never knew I had because I'd never been forced to use it before. Pain, as cruel as it is, has a way of revealing who you are when everything familiar falls away. I thought about the woman, Rachel, too. I hope she found peace, that she learned to trust herself again. Betrayal doesn't discriminate. It wounds everyone in its path. I no longer felt connected to her story, but I acknowledged the shared lesson. We both believed in someone who wasn't who he claimed to be. If there's one thing I could tell my younger self, it's this: pay attention to patterns, not promises. Anyone can say the right words. Character shows itself over time, in consistency, in transparency, in how someone behaves when no one is watching. I also learned that walking away doesn't mean you failed. Sometimes it means you succeeded in choosing yourself. That lesson changed everything. Now, when I wake up in the morning, I don't brace myself for disappointment. I don't scan the room for signs of trouble. I start my day grounded, present, aware of my own worth. That peace is something I will never trade again. My husband said his business failed, and that lie unraveled our marriage, but it also unraveled the illusion that I needed him to be whole. I was whole all along. I just needed the truth to see it. There came a point when my life no longer felt like a recovery project. It felt like a life again. Not perfect, not untouched by the past, but real in a way it hadn't been for a long time. I stopped introducing my story with explanations or apologies. I stopped feeling the need to justify why my marriage ended. The truth stood on its own. I began to notice how differently people treated me now that I treated myself differently. There was a firmness in my voice, a steadiness in my posture. I didn't rush to fill silence. I didn't overextend myself to be liked. I showed up as I was, and that filtered out the people who only valued me for what I gave them. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old box of paperwork, I came across photos from early in my marriage. Daniel and I smiling, arms wrapped around each other, unaware of what lay ahead. I studied my face in those pictures. I looked hopeful, open. I didn't feel foolish looking at her. I felt protective. She loved with sincerity.
She trusted because she believed in goodness. That was never her mistake. I kept one photo and threw the rest away, not out of bitterness, but because I didn't need physical reminders of something I had already processed emotionally. My son continued to grow, his questions becoming more thoughtful, more layered. One evening, he asked why his father didn't live with us anymore. He was old enough now to sense that the earlier explanations were incomplete. I chose my words carefully. I told him that sometimes adults make choices that hurt others, and when that happens, it's healthier to live separately than to stay in a place where trust is broken. He thought about that for a while, then asked if trust could ever come back once it was broken. I told him sometimes it can, but it takes honesty, effort, and time, and even then it may never look the same. He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that truth. I was proud of the way he handled it. I was proud of myself for not shielding him from reality, but also not burdening him with bitterness. That balance felt important. It felt right. Daniel and I attended a mediation session months later to adjust some parenting logistics. It was the first time we sat across from each other in a formal setting since the settlement. He looked more subdued, less certain of himself. When the mediator asked if there were any unresolved issues, Daniel glanced at me as if expecting something. I said there were none, and I meant it. Afterward, as we walked out, he thanked me for being fair. I told him fairness was never the problem. Honesty was. He nodded, accepting that truth without argument. It felt like a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had happened between us. That evening, I took myself out to dinner, alone, something I would have felt awkward doing before. I ordered what I wanted, lingered over my meal, watched people come and go. I felt content in my own company. That was new, and it was empowering. I reflected on how far I'd come from the woman who once stood trembling on a stranger's street, watching her husband live a double life. That moment had felt like the end of everything. In reality, it was the beginning of my clarity. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that truth has a way of surfacing no matter how carefully it's buried. And when it does, it asks you a question. Will you look away, or will you face it and choose yourself? I chose myself, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of respect. My husband said his business failed. What actually failed was the lie he built his life on. And when it collapsed, I didn't fall with it. I stepped aside and built something honest in its place.
By the time a full year had passed since everything unraveled, I no longer marked time by before and after. The separation had settled into the background of my life, no longer the defining chapter, just one of many that had shaped me. I stopped waiting for the pain to completely disappear and accepted that some experiences leave echoes. They don't control you, but they remind you to stay awake. I noticed how my instincts had sharpened. I paid attention to people's words, but I trusted their actions more. When something felt off, I didn't talk myself out of it anymore. I paused. I listened. I learned that intuition isn't fear, it's information. At work, I was asked to mentor a new employee. She reminded me of myself years ago, eager, accommodating, always apologizing for taking up space. One afternoon, after a long shift, she told me she admired how calm I seemed under pressure. I smiled and told her calm wasn't something you're born with, it's something you earn when life forces you to stand still inside chaos and find your footing. She asked how I learned that. I didn't tell her my whole story. I just said I learned it the hard way, and that was enough. There were moments when old insecurities tried to resurface, passing couples holding hands, anniversary posts online, quiet evenings when loneliness whispered questions I had already answered. But instead of letting those moments pull me backward, I acknowledged them and let them pass. I reminded myself that companionship without trust is lonelier than solitude. Daniel's role in my emotional landscape had faded almost completely. He remained my son's father, nothing more, nothing less. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he struggled to maintain stability, that his choices continued to follow him in unexpected ways. I didn't feel satisfaction in that knowledge, just confirmation. Lies don't disappear when the truth comes out. They leave damage behind, and someone has to live with it. One afternoon, while sorting through old emails, I came across messages from the early days of our marriage. Plans, jokes, promises. I read them carefully, not with longing, but with curiosity. I could see now where things began to fracture, small omissions, avoided questions, moments I had brushed aside because I wanted peace more than clarity. I didn't judge myself for it. I understood now that wanting peace is human. Learning when peace requires truth is wisdom. My son started asking more questions about life in general, about fairness, about why people lie. I answered as honestly as I could, without burdening him. I told him that people lie when they're afraid of losing something or when they don't want to face the consequences of their choices. I also told him that lying doesn't protect you from consequences, it just delays them. One night, after he fell asleep, I sat on the couch and thought about how much I had grown, not in dramatic ways, but in steady, meaningful ones. I no longer needed validation from someone else to feel secure. I no longer confused endurance with love. I understood that staying isn't always strength. Sometimes leaving is. I thought about the woman I had been when Daniel told me his business failed, how quickly I had rearranged my life to support him, how naturally I had placed his needs above my own without questioning why. I didn't see that as weakness anymore. I saw it as generosity. And generosity, when given to the wrong person, can be exploited. That doesn't make the generosity wrong. It means the recipient didn't deserve it. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in my story, I want you to hear something clearly. Love should not require you to doubt your reality. It should not ask you to ignore patterns, to accept confusion as normal, or to sacrifice your dignity to keep someone else comfortable. Love should feel solid, not slippery. There were days when I felt proud of myself and days when I felt tired. Both were valid. Healing isn't a destination you arrive at and stay forever. It's a practice, one you return to again and again, choosing honesty, choosing boundaries, choosing yourself. My husband said his business failed. That sentence once held so much power over my life. Now it's just a fact from a story I survived. It no longer defines me. What defines me is what I did after the truth came out. I stood up, I paid attention, I chose a different path. And every day since, I've walked it with my eyes open. As my life settled into a rhythm that finally felt like my own, I began to understand something I hadn't before. Closure doesn't always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from acceptance, from realizing that you may never fully understand why someone chose to betray you, and that understanding isn't required for healing. There was a moment, almost 2 years after everything came to light, when Daniel and I sat together at our son's school meeting. We discussed grades, activities, future plans. It was ordinary, calm, civil. And in that ordinariness, I felt something close to peace, not because the past no longer mattered, but because it no longer controlled the present. After the meeting, Daniel lingered. He looked at me with a mixture of regret and something like admiration. He told me I had handled everything with grace. I thanked him politely. Grace, I had learned, isn't something you're praised for while you're in pain. It's something people notice only after you survived. As I walked away, I realized I no longer needed his acknowledgement.
That too was a form of freedom. At home, my son was growing into his own person, forming opinions, testing boundaries, asking big questions. I watched him carefully, mindful of the lessons he was absorbing from the adults around him. I wanted him to understand accountability, empathy, and self-respect, not through lectures, but through example. One evening, he asked me what I would have done differently if I could go back. The question startled me. I thought for a moment before answering. I told him I wouldn't change my capacity to love or trust, but I would listen sooner when something didn't feel right. I would ask questions instead of silencing my instincts. He nodded thoughtfully, as if storing that lesson away for later. That conversation stayed with me. It reminded me that our experiences don't end with us. They ripple outward, shaping how we guide others, how we protect them, how we teach them to navigate the world. I also noticed how my relationship with myself had changed. I spoke more kindly to myself. I stopped replaying old conversations in my head, wishing I had said or done something differently. I accepted that I acted with the information I had at the time. That realization brought a level of self-compassion I hadn't known before. There were moments when memories resurfaced unexpectedly. Passing the street where I once saw Daniel with his second family, hearing a phrase he used to say. Instead of spiraling, I acknowledged the memory and let it pass. Healing had taught me that pain doesn't need to be confronted with force. Sometimes it just needs to be witnessed and released. I began volunteering occasionally at a local support group for women navigating separation and divorce. I didn't share my story in detail unless asked. I listened. I offered reassurance when I could. I recognized the familiar confusion, the self-doubt, the quiet fear in their voices. I wanted them to know they weren't alone, and that clarity, however painful, leads somewhere better. Through those conversations, I saw my own growth reflected back at me. I wasn't the woman seeking answers anymore. I was the woman offering perspective. Looking back now, I understand that betrayal stripped away illusions I didn't even realize I was holding. The illusion that love alone is enough. The illusion that sacrifice guarantees loyalty. The illusion that endurance equals strength. Letting go of those beliefs made room for something healthier to take their place. My husband said his business failed, and in believing that lie, I lost a version of my life that was built on assumptions. But I gained something far more valuable: awareness, discernment, and a deep respect for my own resilience. If there is a final lesson I carry forward, it's this: when the truth arrives, however devastating it may be, it also arrives with an opportunity to choose honesty over comfort, self-respect over familiarity, and growth over stagnation. I took that opportunity, and every day I continue to choose it. There's a quiet kind of strength that comes from knowing you can survive the worst thing you once feared. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't need validation. It simply exists, steady and dependable, like a spine you didn't realize you had until you were forced to stand alone. By the third year after the truth came out, my life had settled into something deeply familiar and deeply mine. Mornings were no longer rushed by anxiety. Evenings were no longer spent waiting for explanations. I had built routines that supported me instead of draining me. Simple things like morning walks, shared dinners with my son, quiet nights with a book. They grounded me in the present instead of anchoring me to the past. There was a moment one afternoon when I realized just how far I had come. I was cleaning out the last remaining box from my old life, one I had avoided for a long time. Inside were documents, mementos, and a single envelope labeled with my handwriting from years ago: 4 emergencies.
I opened it and found a list I had written during the early days of Daniel's supposed business failure: expenses to cut, things to sell, plans to delay, dreams to put on hold. I sat on the floor and read through it slowly. Instead of sadness, I felt something else: gratitude, not for what I had gone through, but for what I had learned. I had been willing to sacrifice everything for someone I loved. That capacity didn't disappear when the marriage ended. It transformed. I now invested that same dedication into myself and my child. I threw the list away. My son was entering a new phase of life, becoming more independent, more expressive. He talked about the future with excitement, not fear. He talked about what he wanted to be, where he wanted to go. I listened, encouraging his curiosity, while reminding him that he didn't need to have everything figured out. Neither did I. One evening, after a long day, he asked me if I was glad things happened the way they did. The question stopped me. I thought carefully before answering. I told him I wasn't glad about the pain or the lies or the hurt, but I was glad I learned the truth. I was glad I chose honesty over comfort, and I was glad I discovered how strong I could be. He smiled and said he thought I was brave. That word stayed with me long after he went to bed. Daniel and I crossed paths less and less outside of parenting responsibilities. When we did, our interactions were respectful and distant. There was no lingering tension, no unresolved emotion pulling at me. The chapter had closed, and I had stopped rereading it. I noticed how differently I approached relationships now, with friends, with colleagues, with myself. I valued consistency. I paid attention to how people showed up, not just what they said. I no longer made excuses for behavior that made me uncomfortable. I trusted that walking away from confusion was an act of self-care, not cruelty. There were people who entered my life briefly and left just as quietly. I let them go without questioning my worth. There were others who stayed, who met me with honesty and mutual respect. Those connections felt lighter, healthier. They didn't require me to disappear to survive. Sometimes, late at night, I would think back to the moment I stood on that unfamiliar street, watching Daniel open the door to another life. That memory no longer hurt the way it once did. It felt distant, like a turning point viewed from far ahead on the road. I could see now that moment wasn't the end of me. It was the end of my silence. My husband said his business failed. That lie asked me to shrink, to doubt myself, to carry weight that was never mine to hold. When the truth came out, I put that weight down, and in doing so, I found my balance. If you're listening and you're standing at the edge of a truth you're afraid to face, I want you to know this: whatever you're holding together with denial will eventually fall apart. But what you rebuild with honesty will stand stronger than anything you imagined. I didn't get the life I thought I had. I got the life I needed. One built on clarity, self-respect, and quiet strength. And that, in the end, is more than enough. There is a moment that comes when you realize you are no longer telling your story to survive it. You're telling it to honor how far you've come. That's where I am now. Not looking backward with pain, not forward with fear, but standing firmly in the present, aware of my own strength in a way I never was before. My life today is not dramatic, and that is its greatest gift. I wake up without knots in my stomach. I make plans without needing permission. I trust my own judgment. Peace, I've learned, is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It simply settles in when chaos finally leaves. My son is older now, taller, more thoughtful. He watches the world carefully, asks deep questions, and shows a kindness that makes my heart swell. When I look at him, I don't see the broken pieces of the past. I see proof that honesty, stability, and love can still grow even after betrayal, especially after betrayal. Daniel remains a chapter in my life, not the whole book. We coexist as parents,
nothing more. There is no bitterness left in me toward him, but there is no longing either. Forgiveness for me didn't mean reopening a door. It meant releasing the weight of anger so I could walk forward unburdened. Sometimes people ask me how I knew it was over, how I found the strength to leave. The truth is, I didn't feel strong at the time. I felt tired. Tired of confusion, tired of shrinking, tired of carrying a reality that didn't belong to me. Strength didn't come first. Choice did. Strength followed. I think about that day often, the day I followed a quiet feeling instead of dismissing it, the day I saw the life my husband had built without me. That moment broke my heart, but it also woke me up. It showed me that love without honesty is not love at all. It is control. It is convenience. It is a slow erosion of self. What I want you to understand if you're listening to this is that betrayal is not the end of your story. It feels like it. It convinces you it is, but it's actually an invitation to stop accepting half-truths, to stop settling for confusion, to stop pouring yourself into someone who is living in fragments. My husband said his business failed. I believed him because I loved him. I trusted him because I thought trust was what made a marriage work. What I learned is this: trust must be protected by truth. Without it, love becomes a sacrifice only one person is making. I didn't walk away with nothing. I walked away with clarity, with self-respect, with a life that no longer requires me to doubt my own reality. I walked away knowing that I can survive loss, rebuild from truth, and choose myself without apology. And that is the lesson I carry with me now. Not anger, not regret, but awareness. If you are standing in a place where something doesn't add up, where your instincts are whispering while your fear is shouting, please listen to the whisper. It is trying to save you years of pain. You deserve honesty. You deserve peace. You deserve a life that feels solid beneath your feet. This is not just my story. It's a reminder. The truth may break your heart, but it will never betray you.